This season turn it up to 10. Sorta like a bad habit, we gon' do it again. Ready or not, we're gonna tie up some ends. Go tell the 36, try to grab all the friends. We're back like we never left. On track like a treble clef. Skip a beat on the 7th rest. Bring feast, we don't pass them over. We got the first fruits, no way to show us. This yoke is easy, this burns light. Even with a loud mouth trying to eat at the mic. Even if we down south, the humidity spike. Veils torn in two, so we gon' be alright. Don't stop, they're in need of it though. Through grace by faith, they could easily grow. New wave, new age, new way to see bro. Now one truth, life, one way to his throne. Can't live on that bread alone. Every word of God's mouth will fuel me on. That's scripture, that's Christ alone. That's grace alone, that's faith alone. All glory to God, cause that's his alone. Since the lamb's been slain, we can each belong. The Lord is my strength, my peace and my song. Yet I'll lay it all down at the feet of his throne. So relax, God is still in control. He knows every care, every fear that you hold. He knows every hair, every need for your soul. Nothing new around here, this story's been told. I'm just saying there's a time in the season you gotta be a Berean. If you just hear and believe it, you could be walking with demons. It could be rendering Caesar. All the things that go to God, that's a little like treason. Wait, welcome back my friends. Did you ever really think we could pass the 10? Our socks up, we about to trend. Cause the whole 36 wanna rap again. Wait, sounds too good to be true. Like rabbinic candy land, ain't no ladder, just shoot. We hold true if it's loaded in the cannon. Best believe it's understanding, if it's not it ain't proof. Like sacred name of the 2-house frame. He gets something tickle, then you fill it in the blanks. It's hide and seek, let's see if you can find out all the little messages you hit before the timeout. Ever seen a scholar with a blue belt? I have, he's about to make your food melt. The loud one and he strikes again, but don't let him close range, he gon' bite your friends. So relax, God is still in control. He knows every care, every fear that you hold. He knows every hair, every need for your soul. Nothing new around here, this story's been told. I bet you feel weak and your life is in tatters. With Bruce Street, your body is battered. You can't reach, trying to climb up that ladder. Sit back and hold fast till Messiah matters.
Welcome to Messiah Matters. My name is Caleb Haig. This is show 527. Let's get into it. This is going to be a fun day. I actually don't see anybody in the chat room right now, and that's okay. I'll have a good time by myself until people show up. Yeah, we got a lot going on. I got headspace in a bunch of different places. I got 1 Corinthians going on, so if you want to join the 1 Corinthians Bible study, you can do so online. trlearningcenter.com is where you can find that. I'm also going to be presenting on the Throne Room of God, the Throne of God, in Marion, Ohio. October 3rd through the 5th is the conference in Marion, Ohio. I'm going to be presenting with, let's see here, David Wilbur is going to be speaking as well. There's some other speakers, and actually, I think on our, Cole, nice. I think on our social media platforms, you can find all the information for the Marion Bible Sukkot Conference, and it's going to be the days right before Sukkot. So it goes Friday night, Saturday, Sunday morning, and then I think Monday night is when Sukkot starts. So time to get home, time to set up your sukkah and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, come check it out. The information is on our social media. I will put something out on TorahResource.com as well. And of course, don't forget that there is the 1 Corinthians Bible study. That has already started, but you can join anytime. And we're going to actually change the time. So tomorrow will be the last time that we'll do it at 4 o'clock. And we're going to have to roll it back an hour. Okay, a lot of announcements there. We got so much to talk about that I decided, hey, let's just have a show where we kind of answer some emails. There's kind of a theme, which is funny because it's not the theme that you would think around the fall festivals, right? We got, Yom Teruah or Rosh Hashanah, however you want to say it, coming up. And then we have Yom Kippur coming up right after that. And then, of course, we have Sukkot right after that. And so that's probably where our minds should be shifting to. But instead, we're going to be talking about, of course, Passover, one of my favorite topics. Okay, before we get started, let me just tell you this. Chegg at TorahResource.com, Chegg at TorahResource.com. We still have a comment line. You can still call it, and we've gotten a couple of voicemails in this past week, which makes me all of a sudden think maybe we shouldn't get rid of the comment line. 253-465-3205. It's 253-465-3205. Catch past shows and merchandise on MessiahMatters.com. TorahResource.com. We got a lot going on at Torah Resource. We're talking to multiple different teachers. We're talking about doing an introduction right now. This is very beginning stages. Introduction to covenant membership, I guess you could say. I don't know. We don't have a name for it or anything, but we're just batting around the idea. You know, a lot of people used to do High Yesod back in the day, and we've had, over the years, we've just had so many requests that Torah Resource do something like it. So we're batting that around. We're talking about it. We're feeling it out. We'll see what happens. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. I know it sounds weird, but it really does help us. We just hit 11,000 subscribers. Now, granted, we've been doing this for a really long time, so maybe it's not that impressive, but it's still, to me, that's awesome. All right. Let's jump in. We got some very interesting things here. The first one we're going to start with, this from Tommy. Email came in. He says, "Hi, Caleb. I imagine this is an old topic you've thoughtfully considered for a long time. I'm a Gentile newcomer to Messianic Judaism, and I have a wife and now a daughter as well. I know this can be a tricky space to exist in. Do you have any advice or encouragement for people like me based on your experience and wisdom?" I'm guessing experience for you, meaning like advice for Messianic fathers. Advice for believing fathers. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I think my best advice is to try to choose your family, should we say routine? Your family halakha. What I mean by that is like how you walk out your faith. Choose that as early as possible. It's hard to implement things later. And I'm going through this right now. You know, my family, we've had a hard time trying to do family devotions or family prayer. Of course, we pray before we go to bed. You know, we pray before every meal, kind of a thing. But we've tried doing morning. We've tried doing afternoon devotions with the family. It's hard because, you know, I have 4 kids, and everybody's got to be somewhere. Homeschool is happening. Co-op is happening. Sports might be happening. There's always something going on. And so it's important, in my opinion, to try to figure out exactly how you're going to do things, though they might change. But, you know, for instance, I try to say either the Shema or the Shemoneh Esrei, the standing prayer, every day in my own time. My family now, we're starting to read 3 chapters of the Bible every single night. We do that usually after dinner. And it started as it's an assignment for my son's co-op, but it's turning into our devotional time, which is really great. And then what do you do on the weekends? You know, if you celebrate Shabbat, what does that look like? And what are you not going to do on Shabbat? How do you not profane the Sabbath? Are you going to, you know, my family, of course, I think that we celebrate a pretty traditional Shabbat. We don't spend money. We try not to travel. There's a lot of things that we do. We try to get together with people. We study the Bible. We study the Torah portion, those kind of things. I think it's important for families to have routines like that. And I think when you implement them young, your kids grow up with them. That's important. I think they get into the routines, and it's something that sticks with them for the rest of their life. If you don't have those, they kind of float, and it's not instilled early. When it comes to like Messianic, like coming into Messianic faith or one law faith or whatever you want to say, that's so hard to give advice. I think, once again, routines. Make sure that you're in the Word every day. There you go. Make sure you're in the Word every day. I'd be interested to see what the chat room says. Advice for new fathers. in a walk of Torah? Read Torah. Yeah, there you go. Read the Torah. That's, one of the things I've talked to a lot of people about this recently. We'll see some of this in the later comments too. I really don't think that a person can know what in the world the apostolic scriptures, the New Testament, is saying unless they have an extremely good foundation in the Torah. And this is one of the things that I think modern day churches are so lacking in. The church today is so disconnected from the Torah itself. And so, and to be honest with you, I think that in some ways, so is Judaism. Judaism today is so focused on oral Torah, right? And the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch, and these kind of things. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with studying those texts, as long as we as believers realize that they're not divinely inspired or anything like that. It's commentary from men. But the Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Bible, is the foundational elements. We know who the Mashiach is because of the Torah. We know how the covenants work because of the Torah. We know the law code that God has given us. The inheritance of the commandments are contained in the Torah. All these things are so foundational for our faith, and if we don't have those, if we don't understand those, and we're not in those constantly, then yeah. And Cole in the chat room says, "Be careful of the pitfalls within Messianic and Hebrew roots." Boy, isn't that the truth? You got people on one end of the spectrum that just want to be like ultra Orthodox or Hasidic Jews with a little bit of Yeshua sprinkled in. On the other hand, you have people who are, you have people who are basically in the Christian church and they just want to put a kippah on every once in a while. And then you have people that are all in between. Everything from, people who are ultra Hebrew roots. And what I mean by that is like, getting into some very, very mystical and sketchy theologies, the Aleph Tav and Hebrew word pictures, and just weird stuff. British Israelism, or what used to be called two-house theology. Just some very odd theological beliefs. And Cole's absolutely right. You got to be really careful with that stuff. So anyway, that's my advice. All right, that didn't take too long. Let's move on. Let's move to. Let's get into some Passover stuff. Okay, this one's kind of going to be quick because I think there might be a misunderstanding here. Okay. Hi, Caleb. In previous episodes, when you have talked about who can partake in the Passover lamb, it is my understanding that you believe to partake, quote unquote, means a person must be circumcised in order to eat the lamb versus participating in the sacrifice. Yes. Okay. So let me break that down. I think what is being said here is obviously you have to be circumcised to be a covenant member and to go to the temple, right? I mean, there is a court of the Gentiles, but it's outside. So to participate in the sacrificial system when the temple was standing, you had to be circumcised. I'm wondering, I have to think about this. I've never thought about this before. Is there ever a time where an uncircumcised person could go into the temple? I'll have to look harder. I don't think so, but I'll have to look. Anyway, so yes, the idea of eating the Passover lamb, you're not allowed, according to Exodus 12, you're not allowed to eat the Passover lamb unless you're circumcised. So covenant membership, right? And this is where we get the texts that talk about there's to be one law for the Jew and for the Gentile. So if you want to participate in eating the lamb, and now the question, there's debate, and there is more debate whether or not it means just the lamb or whether or not it means the meal itself. Can you participate in the Passover meal? Now, obviously, we don't have a temple, so we don't have the lamb. So there has been question, and this has been batted around a lot, even on this show, right? Whether or not someone who's uncircumcised can participate in the Passover meal without the lamb. One of the reasons that this is really important is because at Passover time, oftentimes we have people come in who are not covenant members, right? At least today we do. So you have people who, for instance, Wife wants to come because she goes to a congregation, but the husband is not a believer and doesn't come to the congregation. What do? The wife wants to bring the husband because she wants to introduce him to these things. Do you say no? And I would say, as we look at like 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, it doesn't seem that Paul is super concerned with physical circumcision for the Gentiles who are going to be participating in the Passover in Corinth. Why? It seems to me like it's because there's no lamb. So yeah, I would say that I personally believe it pertains to the lamb. I'm not checking people's drawers every time they come to my Passover Seder, if you know what I mean. Okay, let's keep going. In 2 Chronicles 30:17 through 19, it states that many people who had not consecrated or purified themselves ate the Passover otherwise than prescribed. That's the NASB. And that after Hezekiah's prayer to God, he, quote, healed the people. In this context, would many of the people coming from the northern tribes that were not consecrated be so because of being uncircumcised? If so, since God didn't enforce the punishment for this, but rather gave the blessing because of their circumcised heart, is being uncircumcised in order to eat the Passover lamb a requirement that should still be enforced today? Okay, so I think that I'm not positive, but I think there might be some confusion. And the reason why is because, and I have down here Exodus 43 through 49. We'll read it in just a second. But if you read the 2 Chronicles 30 passage that is being referenced here, it says specifically why they aren't able to eat the Passover, or why they're not supposed to. Because technically they are not clean. That's not uncircumcised. They're not ritually clean. And it says that they haven't had enough time to become ritually clean. So there's really a question here. Is it corpse defilement? Is it coming from, so corpse defilement, 7-day period, right? And there's mikvahs that take place throughout that 7 days. And so if they come from outside the land, and we were talking about this in the 1 Corinthians Bible study last Thursday, if you're coming from outside the land of Israel, it's my contention, it's my belief that no matter what, if you came from outside of Israel, you had to do a 7-day corpse defilement cleansing. Why? Well, within the rabbinical text, they talk a lot about this, and they say that everywhere outside of the land of Israel makes you unclean. Why do they say that? And don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that the rabbis are always right or I always agree with them or anything like that, but they have a lot of good ideas. And the question here would be, are they talking about, like, is what they're saying, was it enforced? And I think it was. The reason why is because if you go outside the land, first of all, the rabbis give the reasoning that the Gentiles don't mark graves. So you don't know, if you're outside of the land, you don't know if they weren't careful to mark graves. So you don't know if you're walking somewhere, you don't know if somebody has been buried there. And if you pass over a grave, you're unclean, right? Corpse defilement. But the other point that would be made is, if let's say that somebody outside of the land who's a Gentile who's not a covenant member, right? Maybe Gentile is the wrong word. It doesn't matter if they're Jew or Gentile. If they're not a covenant member and they touch a corpse, right? Or they touch somebody who has touched a corpse, and then they touch a chair, and then you sit down in that chair, you're unclean. So basically, you don't know. You don't know if nobody's taking precautions to make sure that you're not ritually unclean because of corpse defilement. So anytime a person went outside of the land, it is my belief that if they came back into the land and they wanted to go to the temple, what do they have to do? They had to go be cleansed for 7 days, according to corpse defilement. We see this in Acts 21, right? Paul comes back from his journey. What does he do? He goes and he has to go through 7 days of corpse cleansing at the temple to be able to help these guys with their vow, right? He goes and he pays for the Nazirite vow for him. So all of that to say, I think that what's going on in the 2 Chronicles 30 passage is that you have people who are probably coming from outside of the land. They are defiled by corpse defilement, and they don't have a full 7 days to be able to give to the cleansing period. They probably have the ashes of the red heifer. They probably have taken mikvahs, but they haven't given a full 7 days. And I think that in this case, it seems like God says, okay. And I don't know why I put Exodus 12:43 through 49 here, but let's read it because I put it here in my notes. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it." What does that mean? So we have to understand that this means like someone who's not circumcised, someone who's not a covenant member, right? As soon as you become a covenant member, then you're seen as a native born, essentially, right? And we see this. I reference this pretty much every show now, right? We see this within the prophetic texts. The Gentiles get land rights. The Gentiles become priests they become Levites, right? And then become priests, Isaiah 66. And then Caleb the Kenizzite becomes a model of like the person from Judah, right? He gets the choicest land in the tribe of Judah, even though he's a Kenizzite. Now, there's debate among people what that means. There's two genealogies for him. All right. So once you become circumcised, right? And this doesn't mean going through some like man-made ritual, but once you become a covenant member, you're a covenant member. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. So all the covenant members shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Now, this is interesting because what does it mean to keep the Passover? All right. So this is one of the questions this is one of the pushbacks that we get a lot from those who want to say the Torah has been done away with, right? Oh, well, you can't keep any of the festivals, right? You're just practicing until the temple comes back. Well, there is a truth to this, obviously, because we can't do any of the sacrifices. But in this context, and this is the debate that I was referencing earlier, in this context, what does it mean to keep the Passover? Is it just have to do with the lamb? Or does keeping the Passover have to do with eating matzah? Does it have to do with eating bitter herbs? Does it have to do with, resting on the Shabbats? Does it have? Are there other things besides the sacrifice? And if that's the case, can someone who's not circumcised participate in those things? It's a debate that I think is going to continue to rage. He shall be as a native of the land. So right there, as soon as they're circumcised, he becomes a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. Referencing, of course, the Passover lamb itself. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Okay. So I think it's a good idea, but at the same time, no, I don't think that the people who were coming from the north were uncircumcised. I think the people who were coming from the north were unclean, and I think the text in 2 Chronicles 30 specifically says that. Okay, let's keep going. We have more things on the Passover. Actually, we have, this one is interesting, and this voicemail is one of the reasons I wanted to do 1 Corinthians for the Bible study, is because of this passage and the question that this person asks. Let's listen to it.
Hi, I have a question. I was talking to somebody about how I thought the Lord's Supper was Passover, and they countered with this portion of Scripture in 1 Corinthians 11 before it goes into what's commonly called the Lord's Supper. And it's talking almost like, not that it's like a Passover, like a Luke 22, but it's speaking like, hey, when you guys are coming together, you're nonchalant, you're this, and when you come together, it basically should be to take the Lord's Supper. So it's a little confusing because this gives you the impression that this is almost like a weekly thing, or they're coming together and just more often than what the Passover would be considered, and he's directing them to make it the Lord's Supper. Any insight you could give would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this is a hard one. I think that this is actually, so yeah, there's a lot here. Let's look at it. The reason that this is difficult is because you have, okay, let's slow down and chop this up a little bit. First of all, obviously we have the Luke 22 passage, right, that talks about, what Yeshua is doing at the Last Supper, right? I believe it's a Passover meal. I think the Synoptic Gospels are very clear about that, and So he says this, he takes the bread, he takes the cup, and he blesses these things. He has 2 cups in Luke, right? There's one before the meal, there's one after the meal. Anyone who has heard me talk about this is probably sick of me talking about this, and that's okay. I get it. But the point is that this is following traditional Greco-Roman symposium tradition, right? A cup before the meal, usually a couple of cups during the meal, cup after the meal. The cup was taken. I have a whole book on just the cups that they used, the ornamental cups that they used in the Greco-Roman Deipnons and symposiums. A lot of them have, ornate stories on them. A lot of them, of the gods that they're going to dedicate their cup to, this specific cup that they're going to bless, right? And so the meals that were used here in the Greco-Roman world, the symposiums and whatnot, they were used as a form of worship. And when the cup was dedicated, it was dedicated to a specific god. It was then passed around and everybody would partake in it. Sometimes some of it was dumped out for the god, right? The wine was always mixed with water. There's a whole tradition. The bread itself was blessed, especially in Judaism. We know this specifically for Judaism, that the bread was blessed and was representative of the whole meal. Okay, but ultimately, there's a lot of scholarship on this. Dennis Smith did probably the flagship work on this, from Eucharist to Symposium or Symposium to Eucharist. I forget. Anyway, and after the meal, between the meal proper and I know I'm a broken record on this. In between the meal proper and the second half of the festivities, there was a cup that was dedicated to a god, and then it was passed around again, and everybody would take part in it. And this was like dedicating the meal to this god. Yeshua does this, and he says, "Do it to me." It's a declaration of deity. That's the very first thing that we have to recognize. Yeshua is essentially calling himself God when he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So this is all in Luke 22, right? And then we get to 1 Corinthians. Now, what's going on in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11? Well, this is difficult because for 2,000 years, the church essentially, for 1,900, 2,000 years, the church has essentially said this is the Lord's Supper, right? So they believe that the church predominantly, I would say overwhelmingly, believes, and this isn't just like the evangelical church or the Catholic Church. It's like every branch of Christianity. And even people that we wouldn't think are Christians that call themselves Christians, like the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witness. Like everybody has their form of communion. And so what is it? They believe that obviously in Luke 22, Yeshua is now separating the elements, the bread and the wine. He's separating it from the Passover, and he's instituting something new. This is absolutely ridiculous in my mind. I don't think that this is what's happening. I think he's saying, do the Passover in remembrance of me, right? Okay. So then what's going on in 1 Corinthians? Well, people see 1 Corinthians, they see the quote of Yeshua, right? So the quote of Yeshua is in 11:24 through 25. He said, well, let's start in 23. He says, "For I received from the Lord also what I delivered to you, that the Lord Yeshua on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, also, he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This is the cup. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" This has been a problem, I think, for me specifically, but also I think for those who don't see this as the Lord's Supper. And what I mean by that is, so within Messianic Judaism, what people are going to say, and there's a lot of books on this as well, they're just going to say, oh, Paul's talking about the Passover. He's talking about the Passover in this passage, okay? And this seems to make sense because Paul has already referenced Passover, right? In chapter 5, Paul's already referenced Passover. And so I call this Paul's Passover letter. I think that we're probably close to, like, he's writing this probably really close to Passover. He says that he's going to try to get back to Jerusalem for Shavuot, right? So Passover's on his mind. There's no doubt about it. And I think we see that throughout the letter. But what's going on in 11? Okay, so remember that he's talked about in 10. He's specifically talked about you can't participate in the table of demons and the table of the Lord, right? And so I think in 10 specifically, I think there's a pretty strong argument. If you look at Greco-Roman culture, you look at the symposiums, you look at the Deipnons, right? I think that if you look at those in the ancient context and in the historical context, I think it's pretty clear that Paul is saying you can't go and participate in these symposiums and these Deipnons that are dedicated to other gods. Like, it's a form of worship. You can't do that. You can't do that and then come to the ecclesia, to the church, quote unquote church, and sit down and have your meal and participate unto God. This is what we call things that essentially differ, right? You cannot participate in things that essentially differ. And so to have a meal like this to the pagan gods, and then to have a meal like this to Yeshua or to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, however you want to look at it, this doesn't work. You can't do that, okay? So then we come into 11, and he talks about, it seems like he goes off context here, but he doesn't. He does not go out of context here. And the reason why is because the idea of haircuts, I think he's talking about hair. Now, I know this is controversial. I think he's talking about hair. My father has done a really good article on this, which can be found on TorahResource.com. It's called Should I Remove My Kippah? And he looks at 1 Corinthians 11. And this passage about, having your head covered and whatnot. I think what's going on in the beginning of this is the hairstyles, I think, would signal if a woman was a cult prostitute or not. And, or if a man was a cult prostitute or not. And so when you have these, basically keep in mind that at the symposiums, a lot of the after meal entertainment was cult prostitution, right? You're dedicating a meal and you're worshiping a god in this, in this meal. You get done with the meal. If cult prostitution is part, I'm sorry, like if there are kids listening, I apologize. If this is part of the worship of this god, and we know this kind of stuff happened all the time. In fact, it's talked about a lot in the literature, right? It's not nice stuff. Anyway, the point is that Paul's he doesn't shift out of the Deipnon. He doesn't move out of the symposiums and the Deipnon. He's still right there. He's talking about, cult prostitution, I think, and hairstyles that signal whether or not a person is a cult prostitute or not. Okay. And then he comes back into it. He comes back into his talk of the Deipnon. Now, once again, I haven't found anyone who has really talked a lot about this. Certainly people who are into meals in the Greco-Roman era are going to look at 1 Corinthians 11. People who know this literature well are going to see 10 and 11 and say, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. He's talking about Deipnons. But I still think that within so Andrew McGowan, who's one of the leading scholars in meals in the Greco-Roman era, he sees that, he's done work to say, look, the elements of the Lord's Supper, the elements of communion, I have to watch my language here. The elements of the communion did not become the elements until the late third century. He has a whole book on this. So bread and wine did not become the official elements that were used in the Lord's Supper until the late third century. Let that one sink in for you for just a second. That means that the church was not celebrating with bread and wine all the time. Some people might have been, but they were using meals, full-on meals. They were using cheese. They were using all sorts of stuff. Some used water instead of wine, right? I mean, there's all these different traditions, and it doesn't become solidified as bread and wine until the late third century. The other contribution that Andrew McGowan, who, by the way, By the way, the reason that this is important is because Andrew McGowan is actually an Anglican priest. And so, he's trying to do all this wonderful work on meals in the Greco-Roman era. At the same time, he is in, and I've asked him about this, but he's in a vein of Christianity that is very hyper focused on the elements of the communion and whatnot. He did a dynamite article, which you can download for free off the internet, on the term Lord's Supper. So the Lord's Supper is only used in 1 Corinthians 11. It did not get associated with communion or the Eucharist or whatever you want to say until the 4th century. Let that one sink in. So when Paul uses the term Lord's Supper, he's not talking about communion. He's talking about something else. And the actual word is dapnon. The Lord's dapnon is what he says. So like dinner, the Lord's dinner, formal dinner. Okay, so why all this? Why am I talking about all this? Because I actually don't think he's talking about Passover in 1 Corinthians 11. I think what he is doing is he's using language. I'm becoming more and more, I'm pretty convinced of this at this point. He's talking about dapnons. He's talking about symposiums that the Corinthians know all about. The Corinthians are predominantly Gentiles, right? Certainly there are some Jews there, but they all know the culture of Corinth. Corinth is like the epicenter of pagan worship. If you wanted to worship any god in Corinth, you probably could. And, there's reports of 1,000 cult prostitutes anyway, I mean, it's like to play the Corinthian, right? Like means to fornicate. Why? Because that's what was happening in Corinth. It was horrific. Paul is now talking about these traditions within Corinth and the believing community that's trying to have one foot in each place. What does Paul say? Well, in 10, he says you can't participate in the table of demons and the table of the Lord. Okay, he then goes to what I think is he's talking about haircuts and signaling cult prostitution in the beginning of 11. Come to 1 Corinthians 11:17. But in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as an ecclesia, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it. In part, this is a huge theme within Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians, the idea of factions. And I'm going to talk about this in my 1 Corinthians Bible study. Come check it out. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. I think that what's happening, I'll show my cards here when it comes to 1 Corinthians, and I'm giving you a preview of what is coming in my Bible study, but I think that the ecclesia is actually meeting in multiple different places. I think you have up to 4 different home churches in Corinth. I think that the ecclesia has grown so big that they can't be in one place, except for like special occasions when maybe they rent out a hall or something like that. So it's my belief. I wouldn't fall on my sword for it, as my father always says, but it's my belief that the church is actually meeting in like two to 4 different locations. And that these are like, they're becoming factions. They're becoming cliques, almost like we would say denominations today in the church. Paul's trying to have none of it, but at some points they do come together. Maybe it's for, maybe it's for the holidays, maybe it's for Passover, but I think that they're getting together. They're having banquets. What in their culture, a dapnon or a symposium like meal, and it's a form of worship. They're seeing it together, like all of the congregation of believers are coming together as one group in Corinth, and I think that that's what's going on here, right? And they're seeing it as a form of worship, and Paul is trying to say, okay, that's fine, but you got to be careful, right? All these things are happening, and it's not right. If this is a form of worship, it needs to be a form of worship. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, I think that this means when all of the congregations come together. In other words, all these home churches come together as one big group. When you come together, it is not the Lord's dapnon that you eat. Okay, so the church wants to say this is communion. And the Messianic Jews want to say this is Passover. I want to say this is any kind of a formal meal where the congregation gets together and sees it as a form of worship. Now, pause. because I'm going to tell you right now, trying to describe this to someone when you're having these conversations is not easy. And you really have to kind of know some of the language, but it's okay. Let's keep going. 11:21. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. This is actually a really important verse. Why is it so important? Because within the Greco-Roman meals, you had hierarchy, right? Yeshua talks about this when you go to a wedding. Don't try to sit in the best place, right? Because the person might bring you and put you in the worst spot, and then you're going to be defamed. Instead, sit in the worst spot, and then maybe he'll move you up, kind of a thing, right? So there's class within these meals, and the Corinthians certainly knew it. And here's the thing: the lower classes at the Greco-Roman Deipnons would get the worst food. They'd get the scraps, essentially. The person who was sitting in the best spot would get like the best, right? And the leader of the entire thing, the host, would get like the primest, like the center cut kind of a thing, right? We see this also within the Gospels. The disciples are asking like, who's the most important? Who's better? I'm going to be, like I'm the most important, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So we're still in symposium and Deipnon language here. He's talking about the idea of hierarchy, and one goes hungry, another gets drunk, right? Wait, or what? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? So he's trying to break down class. He's trying to break down the classes that these people within these different groups have. And basically what I think is going on is some of these groups probably have money. Some of them probably are, more well-known in the Corinthian community, outside of the believing community, right? We know that one of them is we know that there are higher ups within the Corinthian community, right? And there's inscriptions as well. Anyway, we come to my 1 Corinthians Bible study, you'll see what I'm talking about. Or do you despise the ecclesia of God and humiliate those who have nothing? Once again, we're talking about classes here. What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. 4. Okay, so what he just said, he's now going to explain. 4. He connects these 23 to 22 and before. 4. I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. You have to keep in mind who the Corinthians are at this point. It's not a bunch of Jews who have celebrated Passover their whole life and have it in their mind that Yeshua is, that Paul's talking about a Passover meal here. What they hear when he talks about a cup and when he talks about bread, what they hear is symposium language. They don't hear Passover language. They hear symposium language. They don't hear communion language. They hear symposium language. So he goes on. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord, Yeshua, on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The Corinthian Gentile is not thinking Passover. The Corinthian Gentile is thinking symposium. Okay, so Yeshua is declaring himself God. And in the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. I think that the Corinthians see this as symposium language. If we're going to come together and we're going to worship God, then we have to do it as the ecclesia of Yeshua. We cannot do it in the way that we think about it in terms of paganism. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Okay, and then he goes on. Once again, I think that it's my belief, and I'm becoming more and more convinced of this. He's not talking about Passover. I think he's talking specifically about the traditional symposium or Greco-Roman meals that the communities would partake in as a form of worship. This is very much in the wheelhouse of the Corinthians. I think they know exactly what he's talking about. I think he uses Yeshua and the words of Yeshua to say, look, if you're going to come together and worship together, you have to do it in remembrance of Yeshua. He's centering this, and this connects back to 10 where he's talking about you can't participate in the table of demons and the table of the Lord. And then he's breaking down these traditions that have no place in the ecclesia, right? If the ecclesia is dedicated to Yeshua, if the ecclesia follows our master, then you can't have these classes where, like, hey, that guy down there, he shines my shoes. He shines my shoes on Sundays. And, I heard that he's a farmhand the other time. Well, I'm not going to give him any food, and I'm not going to give him any wine. It's not like he's lower than me. This does not happen within the Ecclesia of Yeshua. And Philemon is a great book to point to for this. Paul tries to tell Philemon, he tries to tell the owner, I forget my name, I get the names mixed up. He tries to tell the owner that the slave should be treated as a normal person and not as a slave, right? So I think that this is very much on Paul's, in the forefront of Paul's mind, especially since Paul's main theological point is always that Gentiles have inclusion into the covenant, that they shouldn't be seen and treated as second-class citizens. And admittedly, if Passover's around that time, then certainly this would be the case as well, because he's thinking about the fact that Gentiles are included in the family of God. All right, I've talked for a very long time about this. Nothing going on in the chat room. That's okay. But we have more that we could talk about when it comes to Passover. Here's one that I've had since last Passover. It's been in my inbox since last Passover. Shalom, Caleb. You have previously mentioned how Yeshua use of the Greco-Roman symposium was purely a cultural way to observe Passover, not pagan. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I would say that that there are elements, right? We see this in today's, and he's going to go on and say this, but we see this in today's culture, right? At my wedding, my wife threw a bouquet. Well, where did we get that from, right? At my wedding, we danced. At my wedding, we had, we all sat at tables, and my table was up front, right? Like, there's all these elements that you go to a wedding here in America, and you expect specific things. If you go to a wedding over in a different country, you might expect to see different cultural elements. They're not necessarily pagan. Blessing a cup before, I'm setting this up, and this is not what this person has said, but, dedicating a cup to God before a meal or dedicating a cup of wine to God after meal is not inherently pagan. We see this in the Bible, right? Long before the first century. So it's not necessarily pagan, but this is his question. He goes on. Let me stop real quick. The reason I said all that is because there are elements of the symposium that I think are clearly pagan. When we think of like the cups that were used, if you have a cup and the god Zeus is on the cup and you're like dedicating wine in this cup, things that essentially differ, I would say yes. However, how do we distinguish this between pagan things? Weren't basically all of the Greco-Roman world using the symposium to worship false gods? Yes. Also, didn't God say not to worship him with the things the nations do? And he references a slew of passages, Deuteronomy 12:1 through 4, 29 through 31, John 4:24, so on and so on. Okay. I'm asking this because Easter is, hang on. Up here he says, I completely agree with this, as eating with chopsticks is not any more pagan than eating with forks to eat the Passover Seder. Exactly. Right? So there are elements within cultures, they aren't necessarily pagan. I'm asking this because Easter season is upon us, and I was okay with celebrating Easter because I'm not convinced of its pagan origins, but this is a blurred and fuzzy topic. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's going to trigger people, right? People who watch this are going to say, of course, Easter's pagan. I'm not convinced either. I think that there might be elements that we see that have crept in, but even that is suspect. Yeah, I think that, once again, if we have specific things that we can point to and we say, oh, this came from pagan worship, some people would point to things like a Christmas tree, or some people might point to mistletoe, right, and say this is clearly from pagan origins. Okay. Now, I know that there's debate. I know that there's a lot of debate on these things. But people will point to those and say, okay, these have clear pagan origins. If you go to, I don't know, I've never been to a Buddhist temple. I wouldn't go to a Buddhist temple. But if we go to a Buddhist temple and they're using specific elements in their worship, okay, like a cup with their god on it, we shouldn't use that cup with a god on it. right? So, I mean, the rabbis have this debate. Within the rabbinical literature, they have the debate, how much of the symposium can we bring into our own practice without it being pagan? And I think they get some of it wrong, to be completely frank. But ultimately, you can't say that like blessing a cup before or after a meal is pagan. That's just part of worshiping God. If God is the creator of all things, we can't say that that's pagan. Believing that there should be higher classes at your table. Well, is there anything pagan about this? No, but I think that Yeshua and I think that Paul speak against it. Not because it's pagan, but because as believers in Yeshua, we all are seen as one. There's neither male nor female, right? Jew or Gentile, right? So, I mean, we're all one in Christ. And so I think that tradition was kind of done away with. What about elements like, people are going to say Passover traditions like dipping your food. Well, this comes from a cultural element. It had nothing to do with, traditional Passover elements. People, and this still happens in the Middle East. You sit on the floor, right, in like a semicircle, and they'll come and they'll bring a giant bowl, and then you have your bread, and everybody eats out of the giant bowl, right? And so this is what we have in like the Gospels, where he says, the hand that is dipping with me now is the one who's betrayed me, right? So I mean, I think that we'd have to take each element case by case, but just to say that, they were doing these symposiums, I think that Paul speaks against, obviously things that the Torah speaks against, cult prostitution and these kind of things. You can't be part of that. And I think that Paul makes halakhic decisions, decisions on practice, like haircuts. I think that, within that culture, if you had your haircut a certain way, no, you couldn't do that. Guys would have really long hair. You can't do that. You need to, but even that we could take from the Torah as well, right? So I think once again, we need to look at specific rituals to say which ones we would say are pagan or not. Okay. This is going to be probably the final and perhaps the most controversial. All right. Hang on just a second. I want to read a comment here. Corinth's pagan disgustingness was really hit home by your W1 notes. Oh, thank you. Reference the geography of Strabo in what it meant to be dedicated to Aphrodite. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Micah. Yeah, and once again, if you want to go read those notes, sign up trlearningcenter.com. Okay, this one from my very good friend David, not Wilbur, David in Canada. He says this. You mentioned that this is from David. He says, you mentioned that most Christians, quote, keep most of the Torah. I've said this numerous times, right? Throughout the 12 seasons of this show. I think what you mean is that many Christians live in a way that doesn't transgress every part of it. For example, every church-going believer I know would agree that adultery is a sin. But I think calling that, quote, keeping the Torah confuses things. Here's why. If I ask a Christian, do you keep the Torah or the law? The answer is usually no. If I ask, is it a sin to break the instructions in the Old Testament? The answer is also no. But if I get specific, is adultery a sin? They say yes, because Jesus said so. If I ask about eating pork, the answer is no. Jesus did away with those laws. This shows me that Christians don't view the Torah as binding. Their sense of what is sinful comes more from how they interpret Yeshua's words or from what their church culture emphasizes at the time. 80 years ago, many churchgoers would have considered rock and roll, smoking, or playing cards on Sunday to be sinful. Today, those things are seen as harmless. Likewise, as divorce and homosexuality become more normalized in society, many churches shifted to accept them too. That kind of drift doesn't happen in a community that actually guards and treasures the Torah. In North America, we're fortunate that many of our cultural values were shaped initially by Christianity, but sometimes I wonder if many Christians here only keep, quotes, certain commandments by coincidence, because those values happen to line up with culture rather than because they are committed to the biblical standard. In that sense, it's like saying an atheist vegan, quote, keeps the dietary laws. I don't say this to disgrace the average churchgoer, not at all. I have many friends and family who are great disciples of the Master and are faithful to what they know and are being taught. But they are being taught that the Torah/law is something to be disregarded, not kept and treasured. Yeah, I think the reason that this right here hits home with me today is because I've been having these conversations. I've been having these, discussions. Yesterday, I had just a really good conversation with a brother in the Lord, and he said to me, if I would have had one foot in the church and one foot out, my kids would have never come to Torah. His kids are grown. He said I had to completely detach from the church. And, I've been looking a lot at the prophets because I'm doing work for this lecture that I'm going to do at this conference in Marion, Ohio. And it just strikes me over and over and over and over again how the prophets warn against profaning the Shabbat, how they warn against eating unkosher food, how they warn against not celebrating the festivals, or that we will celebrate the festivals. And, it's becoming difficult for me to understand. Now, that doesn't mean don't get me wrong here. I've told several people recently that the silver lining on all this is that I've been shown from the Lord. It's not up to me. It's not up to me to judge people. That's up to the Lord. All I can do is love the Torah, love the Mashiach, and live my life accordingly, right? It's not for me to try to tell someone you're going to hell. So praise the Lord for that. Or you're not a covenant member. Praise the Lord that I'm not the one who gets to decide that. But man, I do have to admit there is a disconnect in the church. The idea of or the view of the Torah. I don't understand how you can be a covenant member and hate some of the most important elements of the Torah, right? And I think some of this comes from some of the books that I'm reading, which I have here. And I think most people will know these books. Paul Sloan, David Wilbur just did an interview with Paul Sloan. This book is dynamite. Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospels, and the Restoration of Israel within first century Judaism. Sloan is not Torah observant. He's a seminary professor, but he argues that Yeshua and the disciples and even Paul were not speaking against the law. Rather, they were, in fact, very much adherent to the law and teaching their followers to do the same. And of course, everybody knows this book, Matthew Bates, Salvation by Allegiance Alone, Rethinking Faith, Works, in the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And as Sloan starts his book with this question, and this is a question that has been very forefront on my mind recently. Before I tell you how he starts this, let's just put this out here and see the reaction, see how this hits you, see how this hits you. If someone came to me, if I were telling you a story and somebody came to me, I said, hey, I had somebody brand new, first time they came into the church building, and they came in and they were saying, hey, I'm very interested. I've been told that you teach XYZ. Tell me, what do I have to do to be saved? If I said to them, you have to keep the Torah. What does that do inside you, right? I mean, we've been trained and taught and whatnot to say, whoa, no, that's not, salvation by faith alone, right? But Yeshua's the one, that's like a quote from Yeshua. The rich young ruler comes to him and says, what do I have to do to be saved? And he says, keep the commandments. Keep the Torah. And this is how Paul Sloan starts his book. He starts his book by saying, look, if you want, if like the rich young ruler comes to Yeshua and says, what do I have to do to be saved? And Yeshua says, keep the commandments. Keep the Torah. I think that every evangelical Christian's head would explode at that. Would we say that Yeshua's words there are like heretical? Of course not, right? And I think that, at some point we do have, I think my friend David here is right. At some point we have to call a spade a spade. If you despise the Torah, or if you say, no, the Torah is not for me, okay, then should we take you at that word? I agree. I think the point about like an atheist vegan, are they keeping the kosher laws? That's a great question. Of course not, right? They're not keeping the kosher laws. And they're probably doing it for reasons, they shouldn't. I'm not saying this to try to I'm not pushing on the view of covenant, covenant inclusion, entrance into the covenant. I'm not pushing on that. I'm just saying these are some of the things that have really been, stirring around in my brain recently. If Yeshua's response, our master's response to somebody saying, what do I have to do to be saved? His response is, keep the Torah. I mean, that throws a wrench in a lot of the theological elements of a lot of churchgoers. Now, once again, I don't think it necessarily does when we look at, what it means to be a covenant member. But I think it is, it's something that I think many Christians today would say, no, that's not right. So that should give us pause. All right. I hope that this has been fun in some way for you. Next week, I've been saying next week we're going to talk about this for a month now. I think next week we're going to try to tackle what is theonomy. And this has been requested by multiple people to have a show about theonomy. I think that over the years, I've done more research and I've kind of come to some different conclusions on theonomy. So I think it'll be fun. I think we'll have a really good time doing it. And yeah. All right. Until then, let me see here. I'm going to give you ways to get a hold of me one more time. chegg@torahresource.com, chegg@torahresource.com. You can still call the comment line, 253-465-3205. It's 253-465-3205. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. I know it sounds weird, but it really does help us. All right. I hope that this conversation has done at least one thing, and that is to glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah. Why? I think you know why. Because Messiah matters.